1.4 million people gone in just 90 days. Not from disease, not from natural disaster, but from one man's calculated revenge. Imagine an empire that had stood for over 100 years, with cities protected by walls 40 feet high, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and wealth that could buy entire kingdoms. Now picture all of that. The palaces, the libraries, the markets filled with silk and gold, reduced to ash and bones in less time than it takes winter to turn to spring. Here's the insane part. The army that did this wasn't even supposed to exist. 20 years earlier, they were just scattered tribes living in tents, considered so primitive that civilized nations didn't even bother to keep records of them. But in 1211, they would unleash a form of warfare so brutal, so efficiently devastating, that military historians still study it today as the perfect example of psychological warfare. The Jin Dynasty controlled the most advanced civilization on Earth. They had gunpowder, steel production, a bureaucracy that had functioned for centuries, and a military that numbered over 1 million soldiers. They looked at the Mongol horsemen and laughed. These were nomads who didn't even have proper siege equipment. They couldn't read or write. They lived in tents. How could they possibly threaten an empire with 40-foot walls? But here's where it gets crazy. Within 3 months of the main assault, the Jin capital was surrounded by pyramids of human heads 30 feet high. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were wiped from the map so completely that archaeologists still can't find their remains. We're talking about a level of destruction that makes other conquerors look like amateurs. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, but left the cities standing. The Romans dominated for centuries, but absorbed the cultures they defeated. Genghis Khan? He turned one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth into a graveyard. And he did it with an army that was outnumbered 10 to 1. The truth behind this story is even crazier than the legends, because what Genghis Khan understood about human psychology and the nature of fear would revolutionize warfare forever. This is Genghis Khan at his absolute peak of destructive power. And boy, did he enjoy making the Jin Dynasty pay for centuries of humiliation. By the time he was done, he didn't just defeat them. He erased them from existence so thoroughly that entire cities simply vanished from history. Welcome to the insane true story of how 3 months of calculated terror brought down an empire that had lasted over a century. By 1206, Genghis Khan had done what no one thought possible, united all the Mongol tribes under one banner. But uniting the steppes was just the beginning. You see, Genghis Khan realized that keeping his newly unified Mongol army together required constant warfare. These were warriors who had been fighting each other for generations. Without an external enemy, they'd turn on each other again. So he turned his eyes to the kingdoms that had kept the Mongols weak and divided for centuries. The first real test came against the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia in 1207. Now, this wasn't just random aggression, it was strategic genius. The Western Xia controlled the Silk Road trade routes, and more importantly, they were allies of the Jin Dynasty. Genghis Khan knew that before he could strike at the Jin, he needed to eliminate their support network. The Tanguts thought their desert fortresses were impregnable. They were wrong. But here's what's really interesting. Genghis Khan didn't destroy them completely. Not yet. He forced them to become vassals, to pay tribute, but left their cities standing. Why? Because he was learning. Every siege, every battle, he was studying how civilized armies fought, how cities defended themselves, what worked and what didn't. The campaign against the Tanguts taught him something crucial. Cities feared destruction more than death. When he besieged their capital and diverted their river to flood the city, the Tanguts surrendered immediately. He filed that lesson away for later. Next came the Karakitai Empire in 1208. This was a more sophisticated enemy. They had Chinese military advisors, proper fortifications, and an army that actually understood tactical warfare. But Genghis Khan had spent the years since unification revolutionizing Mongol warfare. Every warrior was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, a decimal system that allowed for incredible tactical flexibility. Each unit could operate independently, or combine instantly into larger forces. What people didn't realize was that Genghis Khan was also building the world's first true intelligence network. Merchants, refugees, defectors, anyone with information was valuable. He knew the names of enemy generals, their personal weaknesses, which cities had food shortages, where the walls were weak. The Kara-Kitai fell in just 2 years, but not through military might alone. Genghis Khan had mastered the art of psychological warfare. When approaching a city, his forces would build a white tent on the first day, surrender now and live. A red tent on the second day, surrender now and only the leaders die. A black tent on the third day, everyone dies. Cities started surrendering at the sight of white tents, but these were just warm-ups. The real target had always been the Jin Dynasty. They were the ones who had played the Mongol tribes against each other for generations, who had demanded humiliating tribute, who had treated Mongols as subhuman. In 1210, the Jin Dynasty made a fatal mistake. When their emperor died and a new one took the throne, they demanded Genghis Khan come and perform the kowtow, the humiliating submission ceremony. Genghis Khan's response? He spat on the ground and declared war. The Jin Dynasty laughed. They had over 1 million soldiers, cities with walls that had never been breached, and the most advanced military technology in the world, including early cannons and flamethrowers. The entire Mongol population was less than their standing army. How could nomads who lived in tents possibly threaten an empire that had stood for over a century? When Genghis Khan finally moved against the Jin Dynasty in 1211, he didn't just march south with his army like everyone expected. The first phase of his invasion was so unconventional that Jin generals didn't even recognize it as an invasion. Small Mongol units, never more than 1,000 riders, appeared everywhere simultaneously. They didn't attack cities or engage armies. They burned farms, slaughtered livestock, destroyed irrigation systems, and then vanished before Jin forces could respond. Within weeks, the countryside was in chaos. But here's the crucial part that military historians still study today. Genghis Khan had divided the Jin Empire into a grid in his mind. Each Mongol unit had specific coordinates to devastate. They weren't randomly destroying, they were systematically eliminating the Jin's ability to feed their armies and cities. What the Jin didn't realize was that Genghis Khan had spent 5 years placing spies in every major city. These weren't Mongols. They were Jin citizens he had turned, discriminated minorities, ambitious merchants who resented the nobility, even Jin generals who were ethnic Khitans and Jurchens. The Jin had created their own enemies through centuries of oppression, and Genghis Khan was about to weaponize them. The psychological warfare started immediately. In every 10th village, Genghis Khan ordered complete annihilation. Every living thing killed, heads piled in pyramids, bodies left to rot. But in the other 9 villages, let everyone escape. The mathematics were brilliant. For every 1,000 killed, 10,000 would flee in terror, each becoming a vector of fear, spreading stories of Mongol brutality. Within 3 months, the roads to major Jin cities were clogged with refugees. Here's what's absolutely insane. Genghis Khan knew the Jin couldn't feed these refugees. Every starving peasant outside the city walls was a weapon. They spread disease, consumed resources, and most importantly, they spread fear. Stories grew in the telling. 1,000 Mongols became 10,000. Atrocities became supernatural. The Jin army, trained for conventional warfare, had no answer for this. When they marched out to face the Mongols, the horsemen simply retreated, drawing them further from their supply lines. When the Jin forces returned to their cities exhausted, that's when the Mongols struck, hitting supply convoys, isolated units, anything that moved. But the real genius was in the sieges. When the Mongols reached major cities, they didn't immediately attack. Instead, they used captured Chinese engineers, many who had defected willingly, to build something the Jin had never seen. Mobile siege towers that could be assembled in days, not months. Catapults that could launch diseased corpses over walls. And most terrifyingly, they had learned to use Chinese gunpowder weapons against their creators. At the siege of Datong, Genghis Khan revealed another innovation: He drove thousands of Jin prisoners ahead of his army as human shields. The defenders had to choose, kill their own people, or let the Mongols approach. When they chose to shoot, Genghis Khan made sure every refugee for 100 miles heard about it. The Jin were now the monsters, killing their own people. When Genghis Khan reached Jongdu, modern Beijing, in 1214, the Jin capital with over 1 million inhabitants, he deployed his masterpiece of psychological warfare. First, he surrounded the city, but didn't attack. His forces destroyed everything in a 50-mile radius. Every farm burned, every well poisoned, every tree cut down. The city was an island in a sea of ash. Then came the messages, sent by arrow over the walls. Your emperor has fled. Your generals are dead. Your armies are destroyed. Surrender and serve, or resist and cease to exist. The Jin emperor had indeed fled south, abandoning his capital. This was devastating for morale. But what happened next was even worse. Remember those spies Genghis Khan had placed? Gates started opening at night. Food supplies caught fire. Wells were poisoned. Jin soldiers were found dead in their barracks, with their throats cut. The city was destroying itself from within. The Jin tried to negotiate. Genghis Khan's terms were simple: 10,000 horses, 10,000 young men and women, gold equal to the weight of 10,000 horses, and the Jin emperor's daughter as a wife. The Jin, desperate to avoid destruction, agreed. And then, true to his word, Genghis Khan withdrew. For exactly 3 months. Because those 10,000 young men? They were being trained in Mongol tactics, taught the weak points of Jin defenses. When Genghis Khan returned, he brought their own people to destroy them. The final siege of Jongdu lasted 4 months. The Mongols used a new tactic. They built a wooden wall around the entire city, trapping everyone inside. No one could escape. Disease spread. Starvation set in. Reports from the time describe people eating bark, leather, and eventually each other. When the city finally fell in June 1215, the destruction was absolute. Contemporary Chinese records describe pyramids of skulls 30 feet high. The palaces were looted so thoroughly that molten gold reportedly ran through the streets. The imperial library, containing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, burned for 3 months. The smoke could be seen for hundreds of miles. But here's what made it worse. Genghis Khan ordered his troops to hunt down anyone who had fled. For 50 miles in every direction, Mongol units tracked and killed refugees. The message was clear: there is no escape from the Khan's justice. The problem was, Genghis Khan had unleashed something even he couldn't fully control. The complete destruction of the Jin North created a refugee crisis that destabilized all of China. Millions fled south, overwhelming the southern Song dynasty. Disease spread unchecked. Agricultural systems that had taken centuries to develop were destroyed in months. The Yellow River, without maintained dikes, changed course and flooded vast areas, killing hundreds of thousands more. But the Jin destruction didn't stop there. Every Jin city that resisted met the same fate. Genghis Khan had perfected a formula: surround, terrorize, infiltrate, destroy. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years vanished in weeks. The Mongols would force captured engineers to document the city's defenses, then execute everyone and move on. Nothing was left but ruins and bones. What's really interesting, though, is that some Jin generals tried to adapt. They attempted scorched earth tactics, destroying their own countryside to deny the Mongols resources. But Mongols were nomads. They could live on mare's milk and dried meat for months. The Jin were destroying their own ability to resist, while barely inconveniencing their enemies. Little did Genghis Khan know, or perhaps he didn't care, that he was creating an ecological disaster. Northern China's population dropped from 50 million to 8 million. Entire provinces that had been farmland for 2,000 years turned into grassland and desert. The Jin Dynasty's sophisticated irrigation systems, once destroyed, would take centuries to rebuild. However, back among his own generals, questions were being raised about the wisdom of total destruction. Yelu Chukai, A captured Jin advisor, who had earned Genghis Khan's trust, argued that taxing cities would generate more long-term wealth than destroying them. But for Genghis Khan, this wasn't about wealth anymore. It was about sending a message to every other kingdom. Resist me, and your entire civilization ends. Then in 1227, while completing his systematic destruction of the Western Xia kingdom, who had made the fatal mistake of refusing to send troops for his western campaigns, Genghis Khan fell from his horse. For Genghis Khan, as injuries and infections started to take hold, he knew he was dying. But even on his deathbed, he was planning destruction. He ordered his generals to completely eliminate the Western Xia and to finish what they'd started with the Jin. Every member of the royal family, every noble, every record of their existence was to be destroyed. As for Genghis Khan, he died in August 1227. His body carried back to Mongolia in total secrecy. Anyone who saw the funeral procession was killed. His grave location remains unknown to this day, the ultimate irony for a man who erased entire civilizations from history. The final destruction of the Jin Dynasty was completed by his son Ogedei in 1234. The last Jin emperor was hunted down and killed, his entire lineage exterminated. The dynasty that had ruled over 50 million people, that had considered itself the most civilized nation on earth, was gone. Not conquered, not replaced, deleted from existence. What is clear is this. The 3-month campaign in 1215 that broke the Jin capital was the moment traditional warfare died. Genghis Khan had proven that psychological warfare, systematic terror, and the weaponization of fear could destroy empires faster than any conventional army. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were ordinary citizens who had no part in their rulers' decisions. Farmers who had lived peacefully for generations were slaughtered for the crimes of emperors they'd never seen. What is clear is this campaign was an example of how personal revenge can become genocidal when combined with strategic genius. Reports suggest that towards the end, Genghis Khan had gone from a conqueror seeking to unite the world to a force of pure destruction. Modern military historians study the Jin campaign not to replicate it, but to understand how psychological warfare can topple seemingly invincible powers. The tactics Genghis Khan pioneered, using refugees as weapons, selective brutality to maximize terror, turning populations against their governments, these appear in modified forms in modern conflicts. The speed of the Jin collapse, from supreme confidence to complete annihilation in essentially 3 months of concentrated assault, remains one of history's most dramatic examples of how quickly established powers can fall when faced with unconventional warfare. Today, archaeological teams still find mass graves from this period. Entire cities mentioned in pre-Mongol records have never been located. The cultural loss was incalculable. Art, literature, technology, and knowledge accumulated over millennia vanished forever. The Jin dynasty's destruction was so complete that later Chinese historians had to reconstruct their history from fragments and mentions in other sources. Perhaps most chilling is how calculated it all was. This wasn't mindless barbarian rage. It was methodical, strategic annihilation designed for maximum psychological impact. Genghis Khan understood that empires aren't just buildings and armies. They're ideas, cultures, collective memories. And he figured out how to erase all of it in just 3 months. Now, whilst the story of Genghis Khan's 3-month annihilation of the Jin capital is pretty terrifying, I still wouldn't call him the most cold-blooded conqueror in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Tamerlane, who made pyramids from 90,000 human skulls just to make a point, and killed 5% of the world's population while thinking he was being merciful. The details of his campaigns make even Genghis Khan look restrained by comparison. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about how psychological warfare destroyed one of history's greatest empires. And I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!